Welcome to the channel, everybody, where we debunk lies told by pseudo-intellectuals and agents of disinformation. On the chopping block today, supplement salesman Alex Jones. Recently on an episode of The Alex Jones Show, he said this.
Zelensky is now officially a dictator in Ukraine.
And that is a lie. President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine has been democratically elected, and he is not in violation of the Constitution. This is Russian propaganda, and that is kind of what we're going to do here today. We are going to catch Alex repeating Russian propaganda, which he does regularly and has for over a decade, and then we're going to debunk it. So this particular piece of propaganda comes all the way from the top, from Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has said many times that Zelensky is an illegitimate president.
Отдаем себе отчет в том, что легитимность действующего главы государства, она закончилась.
They based this claim on the fact that Ukraine did not have a presidential election when Zelensky's 5-year term as president ended in May of 2024. So they consider him an illegitimate leader, a dictator. This is really pretty easy to debunk. Putin says that it is not in their constitution, that he continues as president under martial law, and that is just not true. So here we have a document called Law of Ukraine from Rada Verkhovna, which is the Ukrainian parliament. So then we scroll down to Article 19 of the Law of the Land, and we see that presidential elections are prohibited under martial law. And as we all know, Ukraine has been under martial law since being invaded by the superpower Russia on February 24th, 2022. And there are a number of good reasons to not have a presidential election when your country is being invaded by a superpower and you are at full-on war to defend your lands. First off, 6.8 million Ukrainians have left the country since the start of the invasion. 4 million have been internally displaced. And there are hundreds of thousands of active duty military personnel who are currently very busy fighting on the front lines. Furthermore, things like rallies, debates, and voting locations would become Russian targets. And President Zelensky has control over the media currently in the country, which would give him an unfair advantage over political opponents. So this one was pretty easy to track down, and I am surprised that Jones, who claims,
But damn it, we've been 98% accurate, okay?
didn't know about Article 19 in the Ukrainian Constitution. Just kidding, of course. He didn't know about it because Alex Jones doesn't read documents, he reads headlines, and he doesn't give a shit about the truth. He only cares about what fits into what he's already been saying and fits into his narrative for his entertainment program. All right, moving on. This next one is comical. Let's listen to the clip.
Before we talk about the latest developments with Putin and others getting on the phone to world leaders over the weekend and saying they had credible intel that Ukraine, backed by NATO groups, is set to detonate a dirty bomb, not a tactical nuke.
And this story was all over the news, major outlets. Of course, all the Russian news outlets carried it. Jones chose to cite this, blog from something called Zero Hedge, written by a person whose nom de plume is Tyler Durden from Fight Club. And it's easy to see why he picked this source because it says false flag in the headline. And if you know Alex Jones, you know that he's never met a false flag that he didn't fall in love with. So let's get into the story. It goes like this. The Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, presented his case to other foreign defense ministers from NATO countries, including the United States, and they essentially laughed him out of the room when he presented his evidence. So let's take a look at what Russia brought to the table when it came to proof. So let's have a look at the Twitter of the Russian Defense Ministry. This is their official Twitter account. And on that same day, October 24th, 2022, they posted these pictures as evidence. Let's look into this picture here, which says development of dirty bomb, and it has a bunch of bags of radioactive waste. And then it says materials used, uranium-235 and plutonium-239, both isotopes that are used in the making of nuclear bombs. So right away in the comments section, a few people tried to bust this one out with this little, I guess it's a fake news report that says Mexican authorities find stolen truck with radioactive materials. There's our picture. It's all the same. but this is not true. So we actually don't get to the truth until a day later on October 25th, when the Slovenian government from their official Twitter account posts this. It's got the same pictures with a red X on it. It says radioactive waste in Slovenia is stored safely and is under supervision. It is not used for making of any dirty bombs. And what Slovenia is talking about is that picture of the trash bags was taken from a PowerPoint put together by their Agency for Radioactive Waste Management. The PowerPoint is about different kinds of radioactive waste and disposal. This was put out in 2010, so that picture's from 2010 from Slovenia. Pretty easy to prove. If we zoom in, it says radioaktivno on the bags, which that is Slovenian for radioactive. Here is how you spell it in Ukrainian, and here's how you spell it in Russian, which are the two dominant languages in Ukraine, so they wouldn't be using the Slovenian spelling of radioactive, that's for sure. And what's in these bags? Well, that's kind of the funny part. These are decommissioned smoke detectors, bags full of smoke detectors. For those of you who do not know, I'll break it down real quick. Smoke detectors often have americium-241, which is a alpha-emitting radioactive isotope. The radiation helps complete an electrical circuit within the detector, and then when smoke gets inside the detector, it blocks or shields that radiation, breaking the circuit and setting off the alarm. All right, so there's a little fire science for you as far as the dirty bomb story goes. After it broke, about 11 days after, UN nuclear inspectors went into Ukraine and they said that the findings were clear and irrefutable. There is no evidence of undeclared nuclear activities or materials, so they gave them a clean bill of health. At this point, I'd like to take a quick pause and thank somebody named Fudgy, who has a big brain on him, and they built this database with the help of AI that has allowed me to search every single Alex Jones show for keywords, has really helped me put this whole thing together. I don't think it would have been possible. There's many other shows also that is included in this tool, this database. So Fudgy, you're the man. I really appreciate you. So the next thing I did was I used this tool to search the keywords Russian propaganda to see if Alex or any of his little buddies at InfoWars issued some sort of retraction that said that it was Russian propaganda, that Ukraine wasn't building a dirty bomb, that it was actually Slovenian smoke detectors. And of course not. Alex is not the kind of guy to issue retractions. He's just totally full of shit and he plows forward. But what I did find when I typed in Russian propaganda was a lot of hits, and I don't really find anything negative. If anybody finds anything negative that Alex has ever said, or has he ever done a story about this is Russian propaganda, or anything about the phenomena that really affects the whole world that is Russian propaganda, I'd like you to let me know in the comments, because this is all like condescending. This is all mocking people who talk about Russian propaganda, almost like it's ridiculous. Like it's Hunter Biden laptop stuff, it's 2016 election stuff. The list goes on, but I don't find them saying Russian propaganda and like putting it in a negative light.
And we have a very accurate rate of about 98% that's well known.
So before we move on, I'd like to ask you to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. It's just, if you've made it this far, please just take a couple minutes to do those things. It would mean a lot to me. All right, let's move on to our next segment. To justify the invasion of Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin said this.
Dear comrades, your fathers, your grandfathers fought against the Nazis, not so that Nazis could now take over power in Ukraine.
All right, so I think it's important to point out that he is saying the country is ran by Nazis. And this is actually really easy to disprove. The current president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is Jewish. Ukraine has parades that look like this. The idea that Nazis are running Ukraine has also been debunked by numerous scholars in the field of genocide and Nazism, including a group of about 200 of them who published this article in the Jewish Journal, where they say that this rhetoric is factually wrong, morally repugnant, and deeply offensive to the memory of billions of victims of Nazism and those who courageously fought against it, including Russian and Ukrainian soldiers of the Red Army. But we could just leave it at that. I mean, how much proof do we really need that this is Russian propaganda? But what gets brought up often to defend the Russian position is the Azov Battalion. Let's have a quick listen to one of Alex Jones's little cronies here. I forget this guy's name. It's not Chase. Chase is the other guy. This guy isn't important enough for me to look it up, but he sometimes fills in for Alex on InfoWars.
Funding actual Nazis in Ukraine, the Azov Battalion. They run around waving Nazi flags. They tattoo swastikas on their arm.
So it's important to remember that the claim is that Ukraine is ran by Nazis when we talk about this Azov Brigade, because these guys have a checkered past. This is not a black and white situation. This isn't really a history or political science YouTube channel, but I couldn't help but get into it. It's really fascinating. So the Azov Battalion was founded in 2014 during the Euromaidan protests and the Revolution of Dignity, where the people of Ukraine ousted their pro-Russian president in favor of a pro-EU government. They were founded by Andrei Beletsky, who was also their first commander and who was a far-right politician and the leader of a group called the Patriot of Ukraine. The Patriot of Ukraine drew members from several far-right, neo-Nazi, neo-fascist type groups in Ukraine. This group can best be described as ultra-nationalist and or neo-Nazi, depending on what source you look at. On their own website, they brag about raiding and closing the shops of foreigners. They were very hostile to social and ethnic minorities. And then some of the other members of the Azov Battalion in the beginning were from this other group called the Misanthropic Division, and several other smaller neo-Nazi, neo-fascist, ultra-nationalist groups. So in the beginning, they were comprised of neo-Nazis. But keep in mind that over the last 10 years, their numbers have been somewhere between 500 and 2,500, and the Ukrainian military has over 1 million service members. So if we look at their flag and we look at their emblems, we see some Nazi and neo-Nazi looking stuff. We see an eagle. We see this thing, the Wolfstangel, like a mirrored version of the Wolfstangel, which was an SS symbol. We see this black sun, which had something to do with the Nazis, and the neo-Nazis adapted it, and it has something to do with the occult, also the Nazi occult. We see their salute. It's a fist over the heart. Looks a lot like the old Heil Hitler. And then we look at the men, and we see a lot of neo-Nazi tattoos. We see just Nazi tattoos. We see swastikas, SS lightning bolts. We see pictures of Hitler. And then we see pictures like this. Here is a group from the Azov Battalion. In 2014, they're holding up a NATO flag, an Azov flag, and a Hitler Youth flag for some reason. This picture was found on the Russian language equivalent to Facebook called VK. This was from 2014. The guy who posted it, here's a picture of him. Swastika, tattoo on one arm, SS lightning bolts on the other. And then here's a picture of him in 2022, right after the invasion, holding a rocket launcher. So he was in the fight and he's got these Nazi tattoos. But remember, this is not a state-funded operation. These guys, to start with, were self-funded. And this is where the story picks up some nuance and it becomes not so black and white. These guys were clearly ultra-nationalists. And at the individual level, many of them were neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and many of them still are. They're against foreigners. They are super anti-Russian. Like, that is kind of the theme of all these alt-right groups. They hate Russians. So early on, a wrench that gets thrown into the clear, cut and dry, these guys are Nazis narrative is that they were funded by a Jewish billionaire named Ihor Kolomoisky. And Ihor was the governor of one of the eastern states in Ukraine. And if you remember, after the Revolution of Dignity, Russia took Crimea, and then they began to occupy and fight in parts of eastern Ukraine. So the Azov Brigade was funded by a Jew early on, which muddies the water when you want to call them a typical neo-fascist, neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic organization. I mean, get a load of this. This is a guy who's the leader of a subgroup within the Azov Battalion. He's the leader of a group called the Jewish 100, and they have this Star of David on top of a black and red flag. And you'll see that here's a picture of a Jewish Azov fighter with the patch and the Azov patch hugging a rabbi. So the Jews are not ashamed of their heritage, their nationality, their ethnicity, their religion. But this red and black flag it's crazy how confusing all this symbolism really is, because this red and black flag is the flag of the Ukrainian insurgent army from 1942, who collaborated with Nazis to take back Western Ukraine from Poland, who had taken it from them in like the year 1919, 1920-ish. I'm actually going to cover that a little more later because the history of the ultra-right in Ukraine is very fascinating, and they did, for a while, acquire some power in Ukraine. But these people, the Ukrainian insurgent army, they eventually turned on the Nazis, turned on the Soviets also and the Poles, so that it was them against three countries because they wanted to establish their own country. They are also responsible for the genocide of 50 to 100,000 Poles in Western Ukraine. So this is really hardly a group that you would think anybody would want to take symbolism from. My best guess is that, yes, these symbols still represent ultranationalism to these guys, but they also represent anti-Ukrainian oppression. From what I've read, these signs and flags and symbols have very little to do with a German ideology from 80 years ago and a lot more to do with Ukrainian pride. Currently, the Azov Battalion has slowly but surely gained the trust of people around the world that they're not neo-Nazis. They've become heroes to some in Ukraine for how hard they fought in Mariupol and just how hard they fight in general and what they've done to protect the country from the Russian invasion. As an example of maybe their standing as far as an extremist group goes, in 2024, in June of this year, they passed something called LEA vetting in the United States, which is we have a LEA law that says we can't supply weapons to extremist groups. And they passed that, so now they can use some of those weapons from the U.S. that we've been providing to Ukraine during this entire invasion. So next I want to move on to the political side, because if you really want to say that Ukraine is ran by Nazis, there's actually quite a bit more evidence going back like 10, 12 years that the far-right, ultranationalist, anti-Semitic political party actually did take some power in 2012, and I want to explain all that. The Azov Battalion is just a militia. They were spawned from political parties, but they are just a small fraction of the Ukrainian forces. They really have no power in Ukraine. But politically speaking, the story in Ukraine is much different, and I'll refer you to this quote from that same Jewish journal where they said they're not Nazis in Ukraine. They did happen to say this: "We do not idolize the Ukrainian state and society like any other country. It has right-wing extremists and violent xenophobic groups. Ukraine also ought to better confront the darker chapters of its painful and complicated history." So let's talk about that history. So in like modern times, I'm not going to go all the way back to World War II. It's fascinating. I've been looking into it, but that's going to be on you. Like I said, this isn't really a history podcast. I just wanted to get to the bottom of the Nazi conspiracy. The other side of this coin, because that's really what it is. This is two sides of the same coin, the Nazi story here. It revolves around this guy, Oleg Tyanenbach. So in 91, Tyanenbach joined the Social National Party of Ukraine, and then already right away we see ties to our story about Azov. The emblem of the Social National Party of Ukraine is this mirrored Wolfsangel thing again, right? This Nazi-looking symbol. In 1998, Tyanenbach became a member of the Ukrainian parliament. In 2002, Tyanenbach was reelected to the Ukrainian parliament as a member of future President Viktor Yushchenko's Our Ukraine bloc. Yushchenko aimed to orient Ukraine to align with Western standards and become a part of the EU and NATO. Tyanenbach's politics at this time were heavily nationalist. He was against the Russian language becoming the second official language of Ukraine. He also wanted to honor the Ukrainian insurgent army for what they did in World War II. Remember that the Ukrainian insurgent army were the ones who flew this red and black flag and who partnered with Nazi Germany to slaughter 50 to 100,000 Poles during World War II. Then in 2004, Tyanenbach was kicked out of the Our Ukrainian parliamentary faction after he gave a speech at the gravesite of a commander of the Ukrainian insurgent army. Let's have a listen to that speech.
Вони готувалися і боролися з москалями, боролися з німцями, боролися з жидвою і з іншою нечистю, яка хотіла забрати в нас нашу українську державу.
So there he is, showing his true colors, ranting and raving about Jews and Russians, calling them vermin. Pretty typical Nazi stuff. So he gets thrown out of his party, and he turns back to the Social National Party, which he was the president of. So then he tries to church up the party. He changes its name to Svoboda. He kicks out some of the more radical far-right people. They kind of cut it with the anti-Jew talk, and they just become really, really ultra-nationalist Ukrainian. And here's another important piece to this story that I forgot to mention. This is all going down like the far-right stronghold in Ukraine is all in western Ukraine. The epicenter is a place called Lviv City, which is in the Lviv Oblast in western Ukraine. And then there's also two other oblasts right next to it. One is called Ternopil and the other is called Ivano-Frankivsk. And these three states are where this ultranationalistic, neo-Nazi, neo-fascist, xenophobic party gets all their support. So let's track Oleg's progress in politics. 2008, he runs for mayor of Kiev, and he receives 1.37% of the vote. And in 2010, he runs for president of Ukraine. He wins 1.43% of the vote. And right about here, 2010, is when this Svoboda party is kind of reaching their peak of popularity. They won about 30% of the local elections, so they had a lot of control and power locally in western Ukraine. If we look at this map here, we see that Svoboda is this olive color or gold, whatever the hell, in western Ukraine, and they won all these. These are like counties within the states of those three oblasts that I talked about earlier, the biggest one being Lviv. In 2012, they hit their peak, where they won 37 seats in the Ukrainian parliament, and Oleg became a party leader, and he actually became kind of a big shot in Ukraine, and he met with powerful people from countries from all around the world, including the United States Secretary of State at the time, John Kerry, and United States presidential candidate, John McCain. He was, one of only like 5 leaders in their whole parliament, so this movement had a lot of power in 2012. And I think this is just speculation from what I've read, but they kind of piggybacked onto a nationwide anti-Russian sentiment, and it took them all the way to getting seats in the parliament. In 2010, they had 0 seats, not even close. This time they won over 10% of the vote. So a real big upswing for the neo-fascist, neo-Nazi, ultra-nationalistic party. So then from 2012 to 2014, that is when the Euromaidan protests happened. That is when the Revolution of Dignity happened, where the Ukrainian people kicked out pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych because he didn't want to join the European Union. And then they had another election in 2014. Oleg Tyanenbach ran for president that year, and he received 1.16% of the vote. So he actually did worse than he did in 2010. So the party's starting to slide off. In the parliament, the Svoboda party lost all 37 seats. They went back down to 0 and lost what power over the country they had. The winner of the 2014 Ukraine presidential election was Petro Poroshenko, and he won by a landslide. If we look at this map, we see that Western Ukraine was big on Petro. So the party, the Svoboda party, still lives in Western Ukraine. They still had control of some of those counties, right? This is where the alt-right faction lives. So they were pretty pro-Petro. So then we fast forward to 2019, and Volodymyr Zelensky and the Servant of the People Party win the presidency by a landslide, and they also win a huge majority in parliament. That year, Oleg Tyanenbach and the Svoboda party teamed up with other far-right parties to try to just win some seats in parliament, and they didn't even come close. They won like 2.5% of the vote, and you have to have at least 5% to get any seats. So the far-right party slid off. The far-right ideology fell off. If we look at this map, we see that Zelensky actually won 2 of the 3 far-right oblasts. They won Ternopil and Ivano-Frankivsk. The only one they didn't win was Lviv. That's the stronghold of this ultranationalistic movement. And that is the only state that Zelensky did not win in 2019. I think this demonstrates nicely that the far-right ideology, far-right neo-Nazi politics have fallen way off in Ukraine. So the idea that in 2022, the country was ran by neo-Nazis and that justified an invasion by Russia is ridiculous. Look at this map. Let's move on to the next segment. Another piece of this Nazi accusation from Russia is that the Nazis were committing genocide against Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine. Let's hear from the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov.
We are talking about preventing neo-Nazis and those promoting genocide from ruling this country.
So that is another big piece of Putin's reason for invading Ukraine. He claimed there was genocide against Russians living in Ukraine. And remember, from 2014 to 2002, right before the invasion, there was a small skirmish type war going on in eastern Ukraine over the Donbass area. It was militia versus militia. That's where the Azov Brigade came in. Russia took Crimea. And then they slowly just started flexing their muscles in eastern Ukraine. So according to the UN, in that time period from 2014 until December of 2021, there were roughly 14,000 people killed, about 3,400 civilians on both sides, 4,400 Ukrainians, and 6,500 Russians killed in those conflicts. So no genocide. There were no mass graves found. Have you heard any news about a mass grave full of Russians in Ukraine found in the last 2 years? Because I sure haven't. Even though there was no evidence, that sure didn't stop Alex. 3 weeks after the invasion, he brings on this guy, Dr. Ding Dong, to spread around some of that Russian propaganda. Let's listen.
Attacking those civilians, is that not a war crime?
Of course, Alex. Indeed, at the time with the attack on Donetsk, I gave interviews in Lugansk saying this is ethnic cleansing, almost tantamount to genocide, what was being done here by these neo-Nazi formations over there in Ukraine that we put in power.
Not surprising that the Putin sycophant Alex Jones found another sycophant to repeat the party narrative coming from the Kremlin that all of Ukraine is Nazi-ran and they are committing genocide. So what I really want to point out in this segment is the Russian hypocrisy, because not only does Ukraine have some neo-Nazi types, so does Russia in a big way. And actually in that Donbass war prior to this invasion, it was often neo-Nazi versus neo-Nazi Ukraine, neo-Nazi versus Russian neo-Nazi. The Russians have a group called the Rushik Group, who are a state-funded paramilitary outfit, and they operate under the Wagner Group. Maybe you've heard of them. Let's talk about the Wagner Group a little bit. The Wagner Group is linked to several extremist groups and white supremacy groups. Some of their founding members belong to the far-right, ultra-nationalist Russian imperial movement, a neo-Nazi movement. One of their founders, Dmitry Utkin, had the call sign Wagner, which he gave himself because Wagner was Adolf Hitler's favorite composer, and the group named themselves after this Dmitry guy. Here's a picture of Dmitry with SS tattoos and an eagle tattoo. So let's talk about how powerful the Wagner Group was. Some of you probably are thinking, man, I've heard that name before, or you know exactly where I'm going with this. They were in the news recently because one of their other leaders, Pavel Prigozhin, he was outspoken about how he didn't like the way the Russian Defense Ministry was handling the invasion of Ukraine. And then the Russian Defense Ministry allegedly dropped a few bombs on 500 members of the Wagner Group in Ukraine. Whoopsie daisy. And this emboldened the Wagner Group to rebel, and they actually took the city of Rostov-on-Don, and then they were heading towards Moscow, but then the mutiny was halted. They reached an agreement with the Defense Ministry, and everything's hunky-dory, but what do you know? Prigozhin and Dmitry are on an airplane some days later, and that airplane somehow explodes, right? There's pieces everywhere. Kilometers apart, they're finding pieces of this plane. It wasn't a mechanical error. So you can speculate all you want. The official report is it was scattered everywhere, but I think everyone is thinking that the Defense Ministry or Putin himself just shot that fucking thing right out of the sky. So speaking of genocide, and I don't think this is actually considered technically genocide. I think it's more like a war crime or something of that nature, but there's something called the Bucha Massacre, which happened during the invasion. Bucha is a town right outside of Kiev, Ukraine, and Russian forces occupied that town for a time. During that time, they killed 458 people, including 9 children under the age of 18. Many of these people had their hands bound, and then they were executed in Bucha. And what do you know who's implicated in that? The Wagner Group. neo-Nazis. So if anyone has neo-Nazis butchering civilians, it's Russia. All right, let's move on and talk about Alex a little bit. First, let me play you this clip where he explains exactly where all his bullshit comes from.
And I gobble up just all the data and then come to my own electrochemical computer decisions, but it's also influenced by the space-time continuum and the knowledge in the universe of God's consciousness flowing through me. So it's not Alex Jones. I'm just a receiver, transmitter, transceiver.
He's a transceiver. So that's just a funny way of him saying that he maps what's new onto the 30-year-long lie he's been telling. So I was kind of curious, man, do I think this guy is paid by Russia? Because, you know, he is hard up for money.
I need your prayer, I need your support, and I need a crap ton of money. I mean, if I had $10 million.
And I think there's no way. I think this, like, Russian propaganda was made for Alex Jones. He's always been anti-America. He's always gotten his news from RT and from TASS, these Russian news outlets. Think about this. Every time there's a major event in the world, Alex Jones blames America. 9/11, that's America. He's responsible for the 911 as an inside job movement. COVID-19, that's America. After a tragic school shooting, Jones claims that the United States government staged the entire event in order to confiscate guns from American citizens. Now this Russia-Ukrainian war, that's America. He takes the side of the evil empire that drops bombs on hospitals because in his traitorous heart, Alex Jones has to take the side that's against America, that's against the West. This guy is the most ungrateful American I've ever heard in my life. He's not a patriot at all. He spent years selling bullshit supplements that don't work to make himself a millionaire, and all he's had to do is sell like entertainment type talking. I don't even know what you would even call this guy other than a scumbag. I also find it hilarious that he spent years rallying against oligarchs and oligarchies, and now he supports Russia. It seems like he's he's not really talking bad about him, but it is a huge oligarch and it's kind of a dictatorship over there. And also because the Trump administration has thrown him a bone and Roger Stone's been on there and he's been able to speak at rallies. Now he's like state media for the United States oligarch. Hilarious. So one final thought on Jones. If you're scared that this is going to turn into World War III, join the crowd, right? That's everybody. Nobody wants to see this thing go fucking nuclear. But if you're taking Jones's word for it, that this is World War III and it's happening now.
It is the hot spot for World War III and billions dead. That's why, Tedros.
Let's get into this fudgy database and see how many times he's called for World War III. So we type in World War and then we use 3 eyes and we get 6,381 results over 2,061 episodes. Now, granted, I'm not sorting through these. I don't know what the context is, but you can bet that he's saying this is coming up. World War III is happening because that's his style. He always calls World War III a fearmonger to the letter. And these go back to 1998. And we change the 3 eyes to the word 3 and we add 229 more results to the pile. All right, then we'll change the word 3 to the numeral 3 and we get about 500 more results. So what are we talking here? Like 7,000, 8,000 times that he's talked about World War III. That's what this guy does. So don't get scared because Alex Jones says that he's full of shit. All right, please like and subscribe and leave a comment to help the channel. Sorry about all the mispronounced Russian and Ukrainian words and names. My name is Greb Kered, your ally in the fight against disinformation.